Ladies and gentlemen, it has been an interesting 24 hours for the Warriors as they have received substantial changes to both Arms and Fury. Not even was on my menu as something that was due to get changed because they were very, very cool. But Blizzard saw fit to implement some interesting switches and moves. Now, one of the things that seems to be quite a common theme with the recent spate of class changes we're seeing in Shadowlands, one, positive thing, responding to feedback, and two, they seem to be definitely trying to cull back a lot of the global cooldown issue by removing stuff that doesn't really make any sense or where they felt some spells were doubling up. So what that means is there is some stuff gone from the Warrior compared to our first quick look that some of you are going to be sad about. Long term, kind of makes sense. I will say, I'll be honest with you guys, from my point of view, this has made some aspects of the Warrior less fun. For other people, though, it has made it more fun. It's really kind of a subjective thing that's happened. Let's start off with the one that most people are very excited about. I'm not entirely sure why. That is the return of Single-Minded Fury. Now, obviously, if you care very much about the look and feel of your character, this is probably a very good thing. Certainly if it's from a transmog perspective or just the idea of a Fury Warrior attacking faster, although personally I felt that with Rampage and the animations involved there, it visually attacked quick enough. But Single-Minded Fury is back. We have been playing around with it. Undeniably, though, not much difference in feel of gameplay compared to Titan's Grip. There just isn't. So their implementation of it this time around is similar to what we've had in the past, is that Single-Minded Fury will provide an 8% damage increase if you are using two one-handed weapons. On top of that, you will get some movement speed according to the tooltip. You will get a 5% movement speed bonus. So I'm sure the big question on your mind, if you're interested in actually the output of the Warrior, is which is better? It will depend, more than likely. There was a reason this was removed, okay? There was a reason this was removed, and that can't be ignored. But it will come down to either one will be clearly better, or there'll be some talent specs where one is slightly better, the other one is slightly better, or it will just turn into choose whatever you want. So, and it doesn't particularly matter to me. I'm not interested which way it goes. What I will say is it does present some balancing problems for Blizzard to sort out. We might even see some developments like we had a long time ago where Single-Minded Fury was better early on, and then later on as bigger, more powerful two-handers and rest of the gear scaled up, Titan's Grip became better. Some concerns which I think are legitimate with this is personal loot and how guilds will handle this. Again, not a concern if you're just looking for Single-Minded Fury for a visual perspective, because you can change your weapons to look like however you want, regardless of what they are. But if you are in a guild, there are definite concerns that on boss 1, there's a one-handed weapon or whatever, and the Warrior gets it, and then on boss 2, he gets the two-handed weapon. That happens, and he's unable to trade either or, and people like the DKs and Rets are going to going, whereas the Rogues on the other side are going, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens, whether they go with some sort of straight strength one-handers, and the prot warriors are going to be pissed, and the prot pallies, etc., etc., etc. So it's one of those that might be a concern going forward. I'm glad it's back for the people who really care about it. One thing I know about this community is that some people are very, very, very enthusiastic about having Single-Minded Fury back, along with Gladiator Stance and things like that. So I'm happy for those guys, but I can confirm, I'm basically saying this because I had so many people coming to me today and asking, are you playing Single-Minded Fury right now? Yes, I am. How does it feel? Exactly the same as Titan's Grip. So there's no difference there whatsoever. Some other changes that have come in then, they've altered some of the talents to how they work. So we've got like Frenzy, which increases your haste. That's working really well, mixed with the kind of rework of Frothing Berserker, where Rampage now has a 20% chance to immediately refund 40 rage, which works really, really well in synergy with some of these combos. Reckless Abandon now. Recklessness also generates 20 more rage, that's 80 rage, and greatly empowers your Bloodthirst and Raging Blow. Very, very cool. So what you're going to see is some interesting combos of stuff. There are some playstyles and talent setups I've messed with here that are really quite extreme on the fingers. Not really quite a surprise to any warrior playing BFA right now to have that feeling. They'll be like, I'm used to destroying my keyboard. But there are some talent setups here that are a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical, and also some talent setups that really are quite intense on the keyboard with the sheer amount of rage that you get going with the Fury Warrior. But overall, I would say, realistically, in terms of gameplay feel, which is what we like to talk about here on the quick looks rather than specific numbers, because I always will say this, it is way, way too early to start digging into specific numbers. I have no doubt that many people will dig into the numbers for that kind of modification, but for me now it's gameplay feel. Fury still feels very much the same. You can either turn it up a little bit in terms of its pace, and you can then turn it back down should you want to. The majority of the changes actually came to the Arms Warrior, so we're going to shoot over to Arms Warrior right now. Arms Warrior got quite a meaty rework compared to Fury. First of all, the mastery has changed, which will either be music to some people's ears or kind of like, oh, why? Because Deep Wounds does such extraordinary damage in BFA right now. Looking at the damage breakdowns of some of our warriors, kind of skews what's actually happening a bit, because you do have to put the skills in there in order to make those deep wounds work, but the deep wounds obviously being cumulative makes it look like it's just doing all of your damage, and you always get those guys going herp derp, all your damage comes from a bleed, which, you know, isn't quite how it works, but a damage breakdown makes it look that way. This time around, though, your mastery is going to be essentially increasing your damage. So I'll read it to you. Mortal Strike, Cleave, and Blade Storm inflict deep wounds, dealing 389 bleed damage over 12 seconds, and increasing the damage the enemy takes from you by X%, depending on how much mastery you have. So you have this damage taken debuff. Now, this is quite cool. I like this. I'm not a big fan of deep wounds myself, just as an FYI, I like the upfront damage of my warrior. That's what I always liked about warriors classically, and specifically from Classic, is that when I hit that Mortal Strike button, I want to see it cut some fucking heads off. It's as simple as that, and having so many abilities that feel like a wet noodle kind of sucks. So Mastery has kind of gone the way of many classes' Mastery. It's just a damage buff, but you should start seeing them hugely meaty Mortal Strikes, them big overpowers. Hopefully, Overpower does start to make its return into feeling good, adding to the Arms Warrior toolkit. The Arms Warrior, for me anyway, always thematically felt like it should revolve around basically Mortal Strike hitting like an absolute truck, and then Execute being in the same vein. So it has returned to that style, and I can tell you, feels pretty good. It's nice to see those big numbers when you press that Mortal Strike button and seeing that result. It stands out above all the rest of the clutter that we see in a lot of scrolling damage. On top of that, then, some significant changes coming back to this idea of kind of reducing the amount of global cooldowns and ability stacking that was going on. As much as I loved the Arms Warrior's first iteration here on Shadowlands, there were plenty of people who were like, there's too much setup. Even our own Finn was the same. He tried it out and was like, yeah, I get it. I get why it's fun, but there's a lot of setup involved here. Namely, doing things like setting up a sweeping strikes with a Ravager down, utilizing that, maybe dropping a Blade Storm on top of that, using a Spear of Bastion on top of that, and then maybe cleaving out of it as well, which is the talent setup that I used in our early quick look for some of those ridiculous damage storms that I was able to create with the Arms Warrior. So they've cut that back. So first and foremost, Ravager has been changed now, and it replaces Blade Storm. You cannot have both anymore. And Ravager has also been changed now so that it's a debuff on a target, and it follows that target around. Yeah, your Ravager will follow the target around. After playing for this, I mean, admittedly, I've only been able to play with this for about 5 hours. No, a bit longer than that, actually. But between 5 and 7 hours. I say I don't like this. I'm okay with it replacing Blade Storm. Fine. It's one less button to press that kind of does the same sort of thing. You're basically making the choice between throwing down an ability that's cleaving and being able to continue to play your own character, or you have this one button where you can kind of take your hands off the keyboard and does a similar sort of effect. But the losing being able to throw Ravager in a specific place, I'm really not a fan of. It certainly does help with, you know, mobs moving around. It's very slow. So if you've got a prot warrior, for example, and he dives into a pack, and then you kind of foolishly go, oh, that must be all he's pulling, and throw your Ravager down, and then he heroic leaps off or charges off and pulls another pack, and then he starts fighting them over there, your Ravager essentially goes to waste. A classic problem a lot of warriors will have, and this isn't really going to solve that unless those mobs are really close, because like I say, the Ravager travel is very, very slow, so it doesn't really even fix that. Like, if they're moving a few yards, so they're backpedaling or something like that to get to the next area or set something up or get you closer to the exit point, whatever you might be doing, then sure, it works fine. But a lot of seasoned warriors will probably understand that being able to pinpoint place your Ravager is actually kind of a skill cap. And there are several encounters in Mythic Plus and in raids where really tight death balls, as we call them, don't really exist. Mobs are kind of spread in a really sort of interesting locale. Happens every now and again. It's a niche thing for sure. But a good warrior will be able to pinpoint place that Ravager in order to hit more enemies than a poor warrior. And that's something that they take advantage of. And I think of fights like Kill Jaden, Mistress Sazine, all encounters like this that kind of require these pinpoint Ravager placements. Losing that kind of sucks. I'm not going to lie. I don't think we gained much by having it happen. But there it is. I will say also that it kind of sometimes just lands in a weird place. I was following it around, so you physically do throw the weapon, you can see the animation, and if you get a good... it seems to be a range thing. I've noticed some other people bring it up to me, is that if you're right on top of the target, it kind of throws past it and then has to come back. If you have a few yards, it kind of lands in exactly where you would think it would be, which is directly under the mob you're targeting, but every now and again you'll just notice that the Ravager just kind of lands away from you and isn't hitting some of the targets that are in the group of enemies you're DPSing. So you can adjust for it. I've adjusted to it already. So you kind of throw it where you think it's going to go. And it does work 9 times out of 10. It's just one of those things that you generally notice. On top of that, they've changed Cleave now. So Cleave was on top of all your other spells, but now it literally replaces Sweeping Strikes. And they've dropped the idea that you had to whirlwind 3 enemies in order to activate Cleave. It's now just a spell on a cooldown. It gets rid of Sweeping Strikes. It's 20 rage, 6-second cooldown. Still hits very, very hard. Unquestionably still hits very, very hard and causes deep wounds. But, yeah, I mean, this is what I'm saying. I find this a lot less fun. Like, all these changes for arms in particular, I don't care much for the mastery. It never really bothered me. But the actual gameplay stuff, like, Ravager feels like fire and forget at this point. Cleave feels really unrewarding. It was nice with the other setup because you kind of had this in the between dropping these mega bombs and you felt really malicious. You felt like an absolute colossus. Gameplay-wise, it is probably better though. I'm not I'm not going to dispute that. For most players, this is probably an improvement. Again, it drops the idea of having sweeping strikes and then trying to cleave and mortal strike with it on top of it and using all that rage and feeling rage starved. I didn't feel particularly rage starved after playing this at all, and I think part of that is down to having less things to set up. So more of my attacks were straight up attacks, which worked pretty well overall. So those are really the major changes. There is another one which is collateral damage. It's in the same row as Warbreaker and Cleave. That is, when Sweeping Strikes ends, your next Whirlwind deals 25% increased damage for each ability used during Sweeping Strikes that damaged a second target. So if you're using Sweeping Strikes correctly, in terms of actually sweeping those strikes, you'll get this buff. And it happens after Sweeping Strike ends. So you can still use Whirlwind and things inside of Sweeping Strikes, and it won't eat up these charges if you're trying to build to something. And then when it ends, you get these stacks, which will give you this big bonus to Whirlwind. I'm not sure what they're thinking with this, and it could probably just do with some adjustment, because, frankly, Warbreaker and Cleave are way simpler to use and are always effective in what they're doing. So, and this one, the problem is, Whirlwind hits like a wet fart. Like, Whirlwind just sucks. So, having all these damage bonuses on it, like, makes it still hit, like, less than a Mortal Strike. So, I mean, I don't know. It feels like a lot of... There's not degenerate gameplay that you're going to use inside it to try and manipulate it, because it's just not worth it. It's just like a nice little bonus that you get. But you compare it to Warbreaker and Cleave, and you're like, I don't really see why I would ever take this ability that's got to give this variable number. It relies on Sweeping Strikes to generate it, whereas Warbreaker just works, and Cleave works if I'm going to be constantly cleaving. Then Cleave is going to work, as Cleave hits up to 5 enemies. So if I'm going to be facing those situations regularly, I'm going to take Cleave. If not, and I'm just doing 2, 3, or whatever enemies, I'm probably going to take Warbreaker. So that could probably do with a little bit of a look to see what they're thinking with it. So those are the major changes to the Warrior. Overall, I'm in 2 minds on this. One, personally, I unquestionably find this a little less fun. Certainly on the arms side. Like Fury, I can't really tell the difference. It still plays as fun as it was, and Fury's still fine. But most of you probably are aware, like for my personal main choice, Arms Warrior was way up there. I was really enjoying the new Arms Warrior, and I liked the setup, and I liked the payoff of dropping that Blade Storm after you got everything going, and then having to sit, kind of having this moment of sitting back and relaxing, as your character was shredding everything to death. I have no doubt that it was causing some tuning number issues, but they can always be adjusted. Personally, I find this a little more watered down, a little more clinical, and just a little less interesting. Like, firing off Ravager now isn't particularly interesting. If I'm AoEing, I just shoot off Ravager. I don't even having to think about putting it in the right place was something that was involving. Now it's kind of fire and forget for the most part. And you cleave if you can cleave. You know, it's one of those, it's like, it wasn't the case of setting it up. But I will rest my disappointment, because I imagine many of you actually think all these changes are very, very cool. I'm probably more happy with Single-Minded Fury and maybe the Mastery change than any of these mechanical changes that you guys haven't had a chance to even play yet. So I understand that point of view as well. We'll look at if there's anything more to check going on in Shadowlands, which I'm sure there will, as the Covenants are likely to be adjusted again after these changes. That is seemingly the routes Blizzard is going, is class changes, then probably Covenant changes, then Soulbind changes. So we'll keep an eye on it as we go forward. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.